So I've been in this role leading the global innovation team at Digitas LBI for the last 8 months. And I just wanted to reflect on some of the things that I've learned along that journey, some of the things that I think are really important when we think about service design and innovation and transformation. And so there is no innovation fast lane, and I don't mean that as kind of a big downer, but I think a lot about what innovation means. It's in my job title. And the problem that I have with the word is that, to me, it really only makes sense with hindsight. That it's something that when you look back, and actually a word like transformation is the same, it's only when you look back and you see kind of the full context that you're able to say, okay, we started there and we've moved to here and we've done something that's really transformative. But actually, when you're in the moment, it looks and feels a little bit more like this. It's chaotic, it's messy, it's unpredictable, could go either way, there's a high chance of failure, and there's a big dose of serendipity that's kind of required. I'm reading a book at the moment which is called Happy Accidents, and it's all about the role of serendipity in medical research. And it's almost frightening, the number of discoveries that have really been happened upon by people who were open to discovering something, but really didn't intend to discover that. And so the challenge that I have in my role, which is within a very large, very commercial organization, is that words like chaos, unpredictable, uncertainty, failure, really do strike fear into the heart of the other people that I work with, our clients, and it is really difficult to get our heads around. And one of the reasons in my world is because we're really preoccupied by these things. These are really important metrics to all of our clients. They didn't used to be when digital was something that there wasn't so much money being invested in. We had more creative freedom to do different things. But now, actually, even moving any one of these metrics by a very small amount can have a massive impact on the health of a business. But what it ends up doing is almost creating like this envelope. We're focusing on all of these different things. And so the question that I ask myself and that I ask my team almost every day is, how can we do more? How can we push this envelope, or how can we step outside of it altogether? And the language that we use is beyond business as usual. And the lesson that I've learned, at least within a large organization like mine, is a little bit like Marcus mentioned in his talk, which was, it really takes time. Innovation is not a quick win. I often think that I should have a deck which just contains lots of bright, shiny, whizzy digital things, because that's the context in which innovation is often seen. But I think that's not an effective way of thinking about it, what it's about, in that we're trying to do something a lot deeper, a lot more long-term, a lot more transformative, and it's a journey. It's not an overnight success. Of course, there might be quick wins along the way, and if you see something, jump on it, exploit the crap out of it immediately, but that's not the point. The quick win is not what the innovation is all about. So the second thing that I've really learned is how important it is to solve a real problem, and that sounds obvious. So obvious that it's almost not worth saying at all. Almost, but not quite. Einstein has this really great quote when asked if he had an hour to solve a difficult problem, how would he use it? And he says 55 minutes to be spent on thinking about the problem and 5 minutes to be spent on the solution. And the reason is to avoid this, which Tim Malbon from Made by Many talks about as digital landfill, which I love, because it's this idea of producing things that really are a drain on everyone. They're a waste of resources from a business, and they're a waste of customers' time as well. And I don't know if you remember these two examples. Colour is obviously the more recent one. So Colour raised $41 million before it even launched, and I don't know what it did. It blew up within the first 2 weeks. It really did not very much at all. And then Boo.com, which is an older example, but they burned through $135 million before disappearing because fundamentally they did things that no one wanted. They weren't solving any meaningful problem. And on top of that, in my position, I often have to defend the activity that I'm doing because, as I mentioned before, innovation is not quick. So there's not an immediate return on investment. But by solving a real problem that actually matters, you're guaranteeing that if you can do anything that goes some way to start solving it, you're creating value for the business or for customers. You're doing something that's worthwhile. The next thing that I've learned is about connecting. And I don't know whether you'll recognize the face, I'm sure you'll recognize the story, but this guy, George de Mestral, was a scientist, and he was working on adhesives, and he got quite stuck on a project, and so he put on his boots and went to take his dog for a walk in the forest, and he got even more frustrated because these little burrs kept sticking to his trousers and sticking to his dog. And afterwards, as he was unpicking them, soon his frustration actually turned to inspiration because these little burrs were incredibly effective at sticking to stuff. And lo and behold, Velcro was born. And so, let's see if this next clicker works. No? Oh, here we go. So Steve Jobs has this really great quote, which is really all about how important it is to have a breadth of experience and have a huge number of different sources to draw on. So as I mentioned beforehand, serendipity is so important to this process. And when you look at the history of innovation, you often see that people who make breakthroughs aren't necessarily the people who have a right to make that breakthrough. They're not necessarily from the same domain. And by talking to people who aren't like you and comparing your experiences versus theirs, or seeing how they approach a problem that you're facing, can often unlock some different kinds of connections or enable you to reframe the problem that you're facing. And so we've really taken this to heart as a team. And so, maybe it's battery. Recently, so in the last 2 months, I've consulted with all of these people around a project that I'm doing about facilitating scientific exchange within the medical community. And they range from people like Jordan Brown from the X Prize to Kelly Sturtzel, who's responsible for content and community at TED, to Greg Williams, who's the executive editor of Wired magazine. And this isn't look at all the people that I talk to, and these aren't people that we have a commercial relationship, by the way. These are individuals who we as a team have cultivated a community and with whom we meet for a coffee and we talk about what we're working on. And we're not looking for anything specific. We're just looking to share insights and do good work collectively. And so as a company, we've now created a community which has more than 150 individuals in it. So this has been over the last 6 months. And so each time I or someone from the team goes to an event like this, we're not looking to make a transaction. It's not about, I have something to offer you, what is it that you're going to offer me? It's about, do we find each other interesting? Might we have things to talk about? How can we keep that conversation going over time and just see where it takes us? Because you just never know. The next thing is the importance of experimenting, and I know that we've talked a lot about prototyping, and that's something that we're probably all very familiar with, and I guess experimenting is quite similar to that, but the way that we do it is very close to almost the scientific definition of an experiment, which is this. And what's so important about this definition of an experiment is establishing the validity of a hypothesis. So again, coming back to the first thing I said around solving a real problem, this isn't about technology solutions in search of a home. This is really about what assumptions are we making and how can we test them. And when you think about kind of the scientific enterprise, a hypothesis can really be about anything. Kind of the world is your oyster, but we take a slightly more pragmatic approach, And it's inspired by the military, and they have this neat concept which is called CD&E, or concept development and experimentation. And it's quite a pragmatic approach, which is essentially, we want to do something new. How can we do it in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of money? How can we find out whether other people have attempted anything similar? How can we learn from them? How can we create an environment where we can run a pilot and test things quickly and effectively in a way that enables us to understand whether we can implement this and scale it? And so that's kind of the territory that we play in. Again, I am within a very commercial organization, and so rooting things in their practical applicability is really important. Oops. Going back. So the way that we start is with questions like this, and I describe them as hard questions, not because there's anything intrinsically difficult about any of them, but because we don't tend to like answering them, because most people prefer to look first at the things that they're confident of the things that they know how to do, because I think all of us want to do well. We want to produce good work. And no one wants to look like an idiot. But the challenge that you have when you're doing something new is that it's not been done before, and there isn't a right way of doing it, and so you're unlikely to do it very well the first time. And it's really important to us, this third point of what's the hardest bit and of what are you least certain. And this is why, if there's one thing to take away from my presentation today, it's this. It's doing the hard stuff early. And the reason is, again, often when you're working on an innovation project, you're looking for investment. And it is so much easier to convince someone to invest or back what you're doing if you've removed the risk or the uncertainty. And what I've been noticing over the last few months is that in every project that we've done, 95% of the project is just work. It's often hard or it's often complicated, but it's just work. But then there's 5%, which is the unknown, which is just we don't know how the hell to do this. Either there's technical uncertainty, or we don't know how people would use something, or we don't know whether we could scale it, or whatever. And it's so important to get that out the way first, even though it's probably the least intuitive thing to do, because you cannot guarantee the result. So we kind of boiled this down to a recipe for how to do that. So we start with the real problem, and that's kind of the big challenge. What is it that you're trying to address? And then we go through this process of breaking down that problem into sub-problems, and then grading each of those sub-problems based on how certain we are of being able to answer it. And then we take the thing that we're least certain of, and we design an experiment to test it. And then we repeat that process, hopefully boiling all the way up to solving the original problem at the top. Often what happens is we uncover more problems than we first expected, and we start tackling those. So Eon were here yesterday, and I wanted to kind of illustrate this process with a really tangible example. So we have been doing a lot of work with Eon over the last few years, and they, at the moment, are in the middle of rolling out smart meters to everyone's homes. And at the point that every Eon customer has a smart meter in their phone, inaccurate meter readings are a thing of the past. But currently, there isn't a smart meter in everyone's home, and so inaccurate meter readings are a thing of the present, and they're incredibly expensive. Relying on people to accurately read their own meters costs the company a huge amount of money. And yet we know that the majority of their customers have a smartphone in their pocket. And so essentially, our problem was this. How can we give those customers a smartphone app so that they can read their meter accurately just by pointing their phone at the meter? And we thought about the sub-problems. Incidentally, EDF has an app which enables you to take a photograph of your meter, but they then send that photograph to Mechanical Turk to actually manually interpret. And we wanted to do this entirely digitally to remove the human element to bring the cost down. So these were the kinds of problems that we had, and as you can see, they're all kind of technical things in this case. And then we graded them based on how confident we were of being able to solve them, and as you can see, so 9 indicates we were really confident. So displaying the meter reading to the customer, send it to the billing system, fine, no problem. These other things were a little bit more challenging. So we did some experiments. All we really wanted to understand was the reason, so this was an item that was on a roadmap. It was part of their digital journey, but it was on a roadmap in 2017. And the reason it was there in 2017 is because no one had any idea how to cost this or work out how long it was going to take. And so all we wanted to do was essentially de-risk the process and understand whether we could do it and what would be involved, and therefore we could accelerate the process by which it would be developed. Another example, so that was an experiment which was really all about technical feasibility. This next example was actually more about legal and compliance. So we've done a lot of work with Swedbank, and one of the things that we noticed that their mobile app customers were doing regularly was checking their balance. And the thing was, it took longer to authenticate and log into the app and get the balance than actually the time that was spent looking at it. It was a really quick action that needed all of these different steps to get there. And so what we wanted to do was essentially create a way where you could shake your phone and that would display the balance for 3 seconds and then it would disappear again with no authentication. Technically, that was completely possible, no worries there. But from a legal perspective, there was a really big challenge. And essentially, our experiment here was just to create a prototype. And it was prototype this dynamic and then give it to the head of legal and the company secretary to have a go. And essentially, they took the app and they shook it and they went, oh, that's great, and carried on doing it. And essentially, in this case, it was much more as a tool to be able to win people over. The last story is clearly not one of ours, but I wanted to talk about it anyway because it's a third type of experiment, which was all about utility. And I don't know whether any of you remember this device or had one of these devices, but Jeff Hawkins, the engineer who designed it, was very confident that he could build a small device like this. The engineering elements were just not in question. But what he didn't know was how would people want to use it. And so the experiment that he did was even more lo-fi than our Eon one, was to create this. And it was just a piece of wood the size of the device that he wanted to make, and he just carried it around in his pocket for 2 weeks. And every time he thought of something that he thought this device should do, he pulled it out of his pocket and he made a note. And essentially he realized that there were 4 things that he kept coming back to that he did every time, and they were reflected in the 4 buttons that are at the bottom of the Palm Pilot, which were calendar, contacts, notes, and to-dos. And as a result, this versus Apple's device, which I think was the Apple Newton, which didn't sell at all, was a disaster of a device, whereas this literally flew off the shelves. Basically because the experiment was around how can we make this thing actually useful. And so ultimately, the reason that all of this is important is to, first of all, justify investment in what you're doing. And I cannot stress that enough. If you work in an organization that wants to see business cases for things, then this is just critical. The second thing is to have a story that even if it's a story about failure, it's a story that brings people on the journey with you. And one of the things that our team tries to do is share successes or failures throughout the company, because what it says is we are trying to do things. We're not always succeeding, but we are trying. And that speaks to the last point about generating value, whatever the outcome. And then the last thing is really to keep going. So most angels or VCs will talk about this kind of ratio. A VC will invest in 10 startups, will expect 9 of them to go nowhere, but will expect the first one to pay 10 times over and pay for all the rest of it. And we, because we're an agency, we're used to taking briefs, or we're used to thinking about very specific deliverables. And the challenge is that when you have one specific deliverable, you don't get multiple bites of the cherry. You can't keep going. You only get one shot. And so in our case, this is where we're developing innovation programs And these programs have very clear missions. So this one is for Sony and was kind of all about content. And this next one was for Sprint Mobile in the US, who wanted to explore emerging technology to capitalize on commercial opportunities. And then this last one is for the Dutch Railway Services, NS Rail, which was all about creating mobile experiences for customers. The thing about all of these programs, which distinguishes them for us within our business, is that they all have very clear missions. There was a clear business reason for starting all of them, but what they would look like, what the results would be, were entirely unpredictable. No one knew when we started what it was that we'd end up producing. So on both sides, this was a completely exploratory journey. There are also some really great examples in the startup world. So I'm sure all of you recognize Rovio and Angry Birds, and this is their homepage now, but their homepage just a few years ago looked like this. And I don't know, I don't recognize any of these games at all. And Angry Birds was the 52nd iteration of a game. And you can imagine that by the 10th go, everyone was getting tired, but it's only with that tenacity that you keep going and you get to something that in their case is one of the most successful games in history and is known and loved the world over. Another great example, I don't know whether any of you remember Bourbon when it came out. This is actually much more recent. So Bourbon was this kind of Me Too social network, a bit Facebook-like. And Kevin Systrom, which is probably a name that you will recognize, noticed that while the majority of the functionality was not being used by anyone, one particular aspect of the product was being used over and over again. And instead of giving up and saying, oh, you know what, people aren't using what we've built, let's just scrap it and start again, he took that one feature and he turned it into this. And you know where this story ends, with a 1 billion transaction or sale with Instagram sold to Facebook earlier this year. And so I guess I wanted this presentation to be about some really practical things that I've learned on this journey, but I hope resonate with all of the projects that you're working on, that this isn't a quick process. There may be quick wins from it, but you shouldn't assume at the outset that it will be quick. Do solve a real problem. One of the frustrations that I have, I mentor a lot of startups, and there are an awful lot of bright, young, smart people who are creating things for problems that do not exist. And I'm sure any of you who work in large organizations know that there are definitely enough problems to go round. So let's start solving them. Connect. You just never know what your next conversation is going to be about, who you're going to meet or what they're going to say, and how that will unlock something for you. Constantly experiment. It's this constant chipping away at a problem that leads to the results. And then last but not least, really keep going. Again, innovation and innovation teams within organizations often have to justify their existence consequently, because it takes time, speaking to the first point, to produce any commercial results. But if you believe in what you're doing, then believe in what you're doing and don't stop until you've done it. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening and bearing with me.
Thank you, Lizzie. I really enjoyed that.
I really liked your presentation. I think it was very practical, and particularly for in-house teams. But just wondering about the makeup of your team. How many have you on your team? What are their types of backgrounds? And how do you get people in and out of your team? How do you keep the team fresh?
Sure. So we're a really lean team. So we have a global innovation officer who is our exec sponsor. There's myself, and then there are 3 innovation leads for North America, for Europe, and for Asia Pacific. And then essentially our resources is access to a pool of talent. So we spend our time networking internally and finding people with, generally they're the people who are kind of T-shaped people who are often building things off the side of their desks, who are a little bit more entrepreneurial. And essentially we create SWAT teams around the specific problems that we're investigating. So it's also for us, part of our culture that we're trying to cultivate it's a nice thing to be able to engage as many people in the agency as possible in this activity. And actually, it's probably worth me saying we very deliberately didn't want to create a lab. The idea that there was kind of an elite group of people who were the people who did innovation was kind of anathema to creating a business where we try and be creative and innovative in everything that we do. The thing that distinguished our team and the people that we invite to work on projects with us is this idea of beyond business as usual, which means that if it's not something that our clients would normally do and it's not something that we would normally do, then it comes to our team.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yep. We have 3 down here. So we'll just have these 3 and then we're going to go for lunch.
Hi, congratulations to an insightful and beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
At one moment you said, sometimes at the beginning of a project, we don't know what we will be delivering at the end. So my question is, how do you then budget such a mission?
Yeah, so it's challenging. So as I said, everything we do starts with a real problem, which is where we're rooted in ensuring that whatever we do will contribute some kind of value. And I guess the difference between what we do and what a regular client team will do is that the client team will know that in order to solve that challenge, so for example, airline client, we want to shift to 40% of our sales direct online. That's the challenge, and we want to do it through a website. The minute that we've got and this is the channel and the way we want to do it, it's kind of predefined. In our situation, we are solution and channel agnostic, and we look at the problem and then we see what's most effective. The way that we do it, so our metrics for our team are direct revenue, indirect revenue, and then kind of brand reputation. So direct revenue will be doing something, so one of our experiments, and then a client actually saying, we want to invest in this with you. You've convinced us that this is possible, now we're going to invest, and then we get paid back. Indirect revenue might be a situation where we work alongside a pitch team, for example. We do something different, we contribute to that effort, and collectively we win new business, and then that's kind of the indirect. And then obviously there's a really strong brand piece where essentially we're helping to position the organization as fit for purpose in the time that we find ourselves.
Thank you.
Phil? Actually, gentleman here. Yeah.
Hi, I thought that was a brilliant presentation, really well articulated and loads of pragmatic stuff to take away, so thanks for that. And I was really taken with the way you've brought quite a rigorous framework to the situations. You talk about stating a real problem, breaking it down to sub-problems, devising experiments in almost a scientific way to try and tackle those problems. What people often connect with innovation is this creative process, so the flash of inspirations or when new ideas emerge, and I'm wondering, other than the thing you spoke about, which was the happy accidents, were there other techniques you use to actually come up with ideas for problems?
Sure, and there's definitely tension between those two things. I think what we've observed is there's nothing more intimidating than a blank sheet of paper, and actually creating some kind of structure, some kind of framework allows people to be super creative within that. So I would say that we've set up a framework which, now having tested it a few times, does enable teams to really let their minds go in all kinds of different directions. But what we do is we have an open blog within the agency, and it kind of sits on our intranet, and we capture what we call sparks. And a spark is essentially made up of it's an idea. It's a first idea. It can come from anywhere. So, you know, people might attend an event like this and be listening to a talk and come back with I've got an interesting idea and I don't know where it fits, but I want to put it somewhere. And essentially we ask that people write down a summary of their concept, what problem it's solving, coming back to that, why they think it's interesting, and whether there are any specific clients that it might be appropriate for or how it fits in. And essentially on probably a monthly basis, we're filtering through all of those different ideas, In some cases, we'll use that as a reason to bring different people from the agency together and internationally, of actually, you guys have this interesting idea and you should talk about it, see where you get to and come back to us, or we'll actually take things forward. But there's no question that, I think it's Louis Pasteur who has a really great quote of chance favours the prepared mind. And so in a lot of this, there is kind of the luck, and as you say, creativity doesn't run to schedule, but you almost want to create the conditions when it does strike, you've immediately got a funnel or a pipeline or a process to put it into that will then be able to spit it out.
So to prepare the fertile ground.
Exactly.
Yeah, thanks very much.